We now move into Module 2 of Statutory Valuation. In this module we're going to be focusing entirely on the resumption legislation on a state level, and so we're going to be looking at the Queensland legislation in some detail. However, it's important that if you are studying in a different state, or if you would like to get a different perspective, it's very important that you do consider looking at the legislation in other states, partly to see the similarities, but it's especially important if you are practicing. So if you are living in Victoria or Tasmania, New South Wales, etc., make sure that you use your own state's legislation, both for comparison with the Queensland legislation and especially for your assignments, because there's no point in applying Queensland legislation if you live in South Australia or Western Australia or somewhere. Generally you'll find considerable overlap, but there are some differences that are worth being aware of. The textbooks, the Brown textbook that we're using at present, or if you have access to other Australian statutory valuation texts such as Hyam's book or the older Roston Collins, are also useful in this regard, because they tend to take an Australian perspective, often comparing and contrasting the different legislation. Overall, it's important in this module to give yourself the opportunity to become familiar with the statutory environment in which compulsory acquisition is couched. It's useful to read as much of the legislation itself as well as the commentaries and so on. The reason for this is that it demystifies the whole question of Acts of Parliament and so on somewhat when you see exactly how it works and what it seeks to set out. What you will find is that by and large legislation aims to be as transparent as possible. However, that aim is often confounded by the need for absolute precision and taking account of all the various possibilities that might come up. And so balancing these two aims, these two principles, simplicity and transparency contrasted to absolute precision in terms of intent, mean that legislation is not always either as straightforward as you'd like it, but it's certainly typically not so complex. For this course, for this module, we're looking primarily at the Act itself, but there's also the textbook to read. I'm asking you to read Chapter 2 of Brown, and also read through the study guide, which will give you an overall map of where the legislation goes.